Greetings.
Hey, everybody.
Hello,
Hi,
Steve.
Steve.
Hi, everyone.
Can you hear me? Hey, sorry.
Yeah, what about we all?
Yeah, I'm so sorry to have been. Yeah, I'm sorry to have been a little bit late getting on here. I was in another conference call. We had a department faculty meeting that ran like 45 minutes over for all the usual reasons. But hey, I see Paul, my friend Paul Dubois.
Hi, Paul. Hi, Steve. How are you? What time are you in?
Let me introduce everybody. So today we are very honored to have Paul Thibault, my longtime friend since I think I met you in Hong Kong, 2002. Okay, so Paul is in Norway right now, and Paul has, well, we have to be very thankful. What is the time here in Norway? It is 3 a.m. in the morning. So we are really, really thankful. And then we have Steve. Steve Fawn is in the same time zone as us in Portland, so it's 6 p.m. And then we have Jay Lemke from San Diego, also 6 p.m. And then we have our student host, Phoebe from Hong Kong. What's the time there, Phoebe? It is 9 a.m. in Hong Kong.
Yeah, 9 a.m. Hi!
Okay, and we have Olesia from Vancouver. Olesia, say hi. Olesia.
Hi everyone. Nice to meet you all.
Yeah, Olesia is in our PhD program in Vancouver, in Simon Fraser U, and so is Qinghua. Qinghua, say hi.
Hello, I'm Qinghua. How is everybody?
Qinghua is most important today because right now Qinghua is hosting the whole virtual meeting on his computer. Okay, now without further ado, today the topic is languaging, is movement and processes, and we have collected a list of questions from our doctoral students from both Simon Fraser University and University of Hong Kong. So over to the student host, or over to Paul. You have got a list of those questions. You can choose to answer any question first.
Okay, so do you want me to... I'll just find the questions. Wait a moment. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I just received the questions, and I think there are about 6 or 7 pages of them, right? Yeah. Does anyone want to put them to me in a more dialogical way?
Okay, Phoebe. I saw Phoebe your questions there, right? Phoebe?
Yeah.
Okay. So, hi. Actually, our
Hello.
first question would be more about self and others through languaging, because I read through some of your journal articles and you have done very delicate event maps to map the interaction between a parent and then the child. Would you mind explaining further how these kinds of analysis of social encounters may provide some examples for us to know more about languaging and the differentiation between first order languaging and then second order language? Thank you.
Well, okay. I mean, there's an awful lot in that. You could start by saying that the infant has a primitive kind of first order languaging without the second order. The second, but very quickly. In fact, evidence shows within about the first 3 months already the second order is impinging on what infants are doing. The second order being the cultural. Okay, all those patterns that we later call things like lexicogrammar. Okay, but I've always liked Bateson's view here that one of the windows into understanding what's going on is through the developmental. He also said that another angle on it, which is important, is the pathological. I know less about that, but the developmental's always fascinated me, Michael Halliday's work in that area is extraordinarily interesting and rich. So I think one of the things I would say is that you refer to a couple of examples, I think, in the question, things I worked on, and I've worked on lots of other things too, is that what we see is, one, the centrality of affect and embodiment, and how this gets more and more shaped by cultural and social dynamics. Okay, so that within a year or so, but that is, I mean, by the end of the first year, the infant is moving into the second order and becoming a social self, or that is, in the very early stages of becoming a social self. Okay, I put the self at the center of recent work because, for a number of reasons, I think it's through languaging that we become selves. We're not born selves, of course. We're born biological human beings, but we become selves through participation in social and cultural dynamics. So I think that's one starting point there. And when you look at early semiosis between infants and parents, for example, you learn an awful lot of things about what's important later as well. Okay, so I hope that, feel free to ask me further. But that's one window onto understanding a lot of the important things that happen later. Linguists have often said that, that they're interested in language and the first words, 9 months and all that sort of thing. I always say to students, you've actually got to understand what happens from the beginning. And that, arguably, from the beginning is before we're even born. Because already we know, it's clear from the scientific evidence that in the last few months of pregnancy, the still unborn infant, or not even infant at that point, is already sensitizing to things in their surrounds, voices, and so on. And also we know now that newborn infants, or probably before, they're already sensitive to the differences, say, between the mother's voice and others' voices and so on. So there are lots of things of that kind. Okay, so the whole process starts even before birth.
I think, just following up briefly on what Paul's describing, the early work of Trevarthen and looking at first language acquisition, or first order languaging and its emergence vis-a-vis second order language, you see the kind of capacity for social cognition, for things like the development and maintenance of intersubjective states, and that begins so early with pre-birth, but also in the very earliest moments of infancy, where infants will respond to different stimuli in the environment in ways that indicate they are coming into this sort of complex dialogic interaction with what eventually becomes for them a more fleshed out second order ecology of linguistic and communicative assets to do what needs done in the life of a being that has these sorts of communicative functionalities that we do as a species. And but Paul, I thought that was a lovely and very holistic contextualization of that question.
The other thing there, you mentioned the ecological, because one of the important things that happens is that they move. Trevarthen's work showed this very clearly, that they from what he called dyadic intersubjectivity, the orientation to the other, for example, the mother or other key caregiver, to around 9 months triadic intersubjectivity, where you engage in joint attention sharing about things beyond the dyad, and there's the beginning of a move away from the dyad to sharing, and you see, I see with my granddaughter when she was around and also my daughter too, my granddaughter being more recent. Around 9 months, they love pointing at things beyond. Okay, so this the pointing is one way of sharing in a world outside the dyad, okay, and therefore they learn to participate in a kind of semiotic commons, okay, and that movement outwards begins a whole process of opening up a world out there, the human ecologies. It's the beginning of the expansion of the self and its objects out in the world, and the ability to share those objects. I use the word object in a broad sense to mean any kind of mental object. What that is, what's being focused on in the attentional sense. So the ability to have joint attention and to share objects with others. Okay, so then the whole ecology starts expanding, as does the self. Angel, I think I see your hand up.
Yeah, because I think this is a very good point to put in Amy, one of the PhD students in Hong Kong. Her question will relate to what you were just saying. I read her question. In the seminar abstract, you propose thinking about language in non-linguistic ways that break the grip of conventional meta-languages or thinking about human languaging. And then Amy asked this question. Would you mind elaborating some more on what you would propose as the key principles or methodological approaches about rethinking and researching about language in non-linguistic and process-based ways for young researchers like her?
Well, I think one of the things I'd say is the meta-language problem that you mentioned is because so much of linguistic theory has it's starting to change. Let's say that, but for a long time, and this is well identified in Per Linnell's book, The Written Language Bias, the technology of writing, which so troubled Plato all those years ago, has been the main meta-language available for modeling something like what I call languaging, okay, as something which it isn't, but basically as text, when in fact its dynamics, its body dynamics shaped by culture, its event, its process going on in time. So getting away from that idea of treating something which is not text as if it were text, I mean, that can have some kinds of uses, but essentially what you end up doing is constituting an object of study which is very different from the phenomenon and treating it as something. Okay, so that's the basic problem there.
You're replacing one meta-language with another meta-language, as I see it. You're replacing the traditional linguistic language of grammar, lexicon, text, this meta-language of traditional linguistics, with another meta-language that is from dynamic systems, event, process, right? I mean, I'm trying to make it accessible to young scholars like me. But you're simply replacing one meta-language with another meta-language, right? And so...
well, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, I mean, the other meta-language has its uses too, but it also has its limitations. It's not a question of wholesale throwing it all away. Okay, because we all. I mean, when you make an orthographic transcription of someone's, speaking a dialogue or a conversation, there's so much that's left out. Now, people, of course, talk about multimodality and so on. But it's all those things that are left out, of which often was sidelined as so-called paralanguage, which I think are absolutely intrinsic to and essential to what languaging is. So it's not to say there's no grammar, there is, but it's to be looked at in a different way as not written rules and all that, but the kinds of constraints that have evolved, which operate through what we're doing. Yeah.
Okay. Let me read to Amy's second language question. According to your theorization on research, can you elucidate some more on the intricate relationships between first-order languaging and second-order language? Specifically, A, how first-order languaging interacts with and integrate with second-order language, and B, how can we explore and describe the characteristics and patterning of complex dynamical languaging performances? What would be the appropriate research methodologies or methodological approaches? This is from Amy's, as a PhD student, her perspective. How the two first order, second order, how the two orders interact, and what's the research methodology to analyze it?
Okay. The first thing to say is the two orders, as you know, they go back to early work by Nigel Love. Okay. And then I've integrated them into my own work in the distributed language perspective. They're not two different levels. What we're doing now is first order languaging. Okay, that's what's going on now. But what in doing that and in making this event happen, this dialogue between you and me, say right now, we draw on these second order resources, we appropriate them, and we integrate them to the real time, so to speak, event, okay, with all its embodied features, in ways that constrain it, that shape it, that orient it, okay, and that scaffold it and so on. So the second order is what comes from those longer cultural historical timescales of a community, of a tradition or something. And it's not something inert. It's something that we constantly transform, appropriate, and modify through our first order languaging. Okay, so it's not it's not a stratified idea. You have the idea of stratification in functional linguistics. It's not that, but the second order works through the first order. Okay, as the intertwining of different timescales. Mm-hmm. Okay, but they're seamlessly interwoven with each other. So we a little earlier we talked about infants. Okay, I like Stephen Cowley's idea of the language stance as one way of explaining how it is that infants they don't just acquire words as if words were pre-packaged entities out there, but they learn to orient to certain patterns, okay, as words. We end up reifying these things as words, okay, and then we think they have a sort of quasi-independent existence separate from the body dynamics. But that itself, that reification, is itself an aspect of how second-order literacy practices and that have trained us, if you like, or educated us to do that through, for example, the way we transcribe the verbal aspect of languaging events. But the important thing is here, they're not separate levels. It's rather the appropriation of resources, of patterns and that come from the longer timescales of a community. I hope that helps to clarify.
Methodology question. As a young researcher, like a PhD student like Amy, is interested in what would that mean, implications for research methodology?
Well, I think one of the things is it's really important from the methodological point of view to pay close attention. This is where you need, say, a video recordings, but fine-grained analysis, the detailed analysis of the dynamical aspects of these events. Okay. And their emergent qualities and so on. So that I like doing that, but gosh, it takes a lot of time and a lot of practice doing it. But once you do that, once you engage in that, rather than just say rely on discourse analytical type transcriptions, which are mainly lexicogrammar based, okay, you go down into fine-grained aspects of the body dynamics, what myself and a few other people in like Stephen Cowley and Sina Stephenson, in recent years have called the Pico-scale, very fine-grained dynamics on time scales of fractions of seconds to milliseconds. Okay, you see how these things really do matter. Okay, in what we're doing with each other, we tune into very fine-grained aspects of vocal and other bodily dynamics, which shape and orient action and perception in real time. So it's very important to get that kind of practice. That would be one methodological lesson that I would draw out of that. Steve, I think he's going. Yeah.
Well, just to build on what Paul's saying, so I have very much benefited from and appreciated the work of Stephen Cowley and Suna Stephenson, looking at this Pico-scale, and Paul's work too. Paul and I haven't talked about this quite as much, but Suna and Stephen Cowley and I don't agree on the efficacy of, say, an ethnomethodological position. If you're looking at the reality of understanding, human communicative interaction, it presupposes what Infield and others have called this enchronic infrastructure for social interaction, the sequential coordination of things that involve micro-interactional analyses showing gaze and pointing and maybe reading aloud or bodily deixis, as well as audible communication, right? And for this first-order languaging piece, as Paul mentioned, and I think very rightly, the micro-interactional detail is sometimes overwhelming, and seemingly it deals with such mundane aspects of the human communicative condition. But something I really like about both Pico-scale and ethnomethodologically or micro-interactionally informed approaches is time is critical. The unfolding, the process ontology of the unfolding moment, and the enchronic frame or the sequential coordination between humans and environments, humans and devices, humans and devices and environments, and looking at how all that works in real time at some level. Pico-analysis is super detailed. Something like conversation analysis is sort of a step up from that, but looks at causal phenomena and looks at bodily deixis and gaze, especially the multimodal varieties that are so important in contemporary work in that area. So I think that is a methodology from Pico-scale to micro-interactional analysis of the sort pursued by, let's just say, open-minded conversation analysts. It can be very powerful, I think, to really get out that real time.
Let's hear from Jay first. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Let's hear from Jay's hands have been up for some
Yes,
time.
I'm very interested in this methodological kind of question, because I wonder, as we go down to the Pico-scale, and we're looking at very fine-grained issues of timing and coordination of body actions and so forth, does it become more difficult to see the effects of the second-order language system because they're operating on longer time scales, or does it become easier to see these patterns? And I'm thinking of this also in relationship to something I know people here are interested in, which is translanguaging. And I begin to wonder if, for example, when people are are drawing on resources from two different traditional second-order language systems, at the same time in their languaging, first-order languaging processes, are there opportunities from that to get a better understanding of how the second-order language constraints, now coming from two directions, as it were, are actually showing up in the Pico-scale or just the ordinary conversational flow, methodologically?
I mean, two things I would say to that is, if you think about it from the Pico end, so the bodily end, these things, after all, are coming from a person and their embodiment, they're energizing and animating. Okay. The second order pattern. Okay. At the same time, as Jay just said too, the second order is not so much a level, but constraints that operate on, modulate, shape, direct, and so on. So it's a kind of dialectical relationship there. And I think one of the things that happens is, in the shifting dynamics of an event, people orient, sometimes the pico-scale is the most important aspect that people are orienting to and being affected by. And in other moments, they're more orienting to things we might call the second order pattern. Okay, so it's, and I think that's what, and maybe in some kind of genres too, take a spontaneous conversation. Okay, people will often be much more attentive there to fine-grained dynamics. Okay, because they're also very much implicated in relations between people and so on. But if you're in a courtroom, okay, maybe people are more attending to lexicogrammatical pattern coming from the second order, okay, about some subtle issue of semantic interpretation. So it's going to vary with situations, okay, but so one thing, but knowing and emphasizing that it comes from persons with their selfhood, okay, the pico-scale can modulate the other things coming from the other scales in very subtle ways. And I think probably, I've not worked on translanguaging, so there are people that involved in this conversation who'll know a lot more about that than I do. But I can imagine that things in the pico-scale could alert, quite unconsciously in many ways, people to very subtle dynamical shifts where they attend to one thing in a particular kind of way. And that, it's not as if the pico-scale is a sort of physicalistic thing that's outside of meaning. It's fully meaningful, okay, but it's not meaningful in the way that has been traditionally thought about, okay. You know, where we think the meanings in lexicogrammar and that, it's okay. It itself can help to enact very, very subtle shifts in the meaning dynamics of the event. So people here in this, I almost said room, but it's not quite room, stretched between three different continents. But what I wanted to say is that people working on translanguaging, as some of you are, in a way I haven't done, will be aware of those sorts of things. Okay, and perhaps you could give us one of you might be able to suggest an example. But anyway, that's roughly what I think about those things there.
Very quickly. So whether you call it translanguaging or languaging, it's about the different kinds of systems constraining you. So like Chinese English. Right now, I'm constraining myself to speak in English only, not Cantonese, not Mandarin. Because I know because of my conscious understanding of the etiquette or the audience. The audience might not be able to understand Chinese English. So all these kinds of expectations, the norms, you might call second order constructs. We are all orienting ourselves to. But back to this methodology question, from what I heard from you, Paul, it sounds like it's conversation analysis, but a 21st update version with multimodal analysis, because conversation analysis focuses on fine-grained analysis, sequential analysis.
What can I say? I've never been, and I don't mean any criticism here. Just it's not a school that I've had a lot of engagement with. All I'm emphasizing is the importance of looking at these fine-grained dynamics. Okay, and that's what the term pico here means. Okay, but and seeing them as central rather than something para or marginal or external to languaging. Okay, so I mean the whole term languaging, after all, is meant to get away from language as we a system of form meaning pairings, and that having some kind of quasi-autonomous status is exactly the thing I want, that all this kind of work seeks to move away from. Okay, because manifestly, when we look at real languaging between people, they're not pairing forms of meanings. Okay, it doesn't work like that.
I think sociolinguists have been talking about this for a long time. They don't see language as an autonomous system. They're setting up a straw person. So let's listen to Qinghua and then Olesya.
All right.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. Just now, when you were describing it, like fine-grained, research, I think, can we treat it as an expansion of our methodological repertoire that we can use, that we can harness according to different research questions that we ask, that we may be able to make different combinations to say that maybe in this study, the fine-grained studies of picoseconds would help. Maybe in another study, when we ask a different research question, maybe that the more focus could be on maybe a larger time scale. Would you agree with this idea that it has to do with different kind of research question that is being asked?
Well, I could only say, okay, no problem with that. Except for me, it's never a question of just looking at one, the Pico on its own. Okay, because but you can zoom into that, so to speak. But then you can also, I think part of what you're saying is we can zoom out. In my work, I always find myself moving between the different scales. Okay, because what is of interest is the way they work together. Okay, so I don't think I'd ever be doing something that looks like a Pico-scale analysis per se, as it were. Okay, but methodologically, yeah, you can focus on the Pico or on something else, but it's not discourse analysis as standardly, where that is mainly focused on the lexicogrammar. Yeah, okay.
The echo dynamic. Okay, Jay and then Olesya.
Yes, no, just a brief point in response to Qinghua and what Paul said. You would never be able to do a Pico analysis of a 10-minute or 30-minute or 1 hour set of discourse and text or conversation or what have you. So you have to decide what are the short periods of 2 or 3 seconds or 5 or 10 seconds when you want to do the Pico analysis and where you think it's going to have some important contribution to understanding what is going on at the longer scales that you may also or even primarily be interested in. So I think it's not quite so much a question of what your research question wants to focus on, but it's also a question that you need a sense of when to drop down to the Pico level, right? Because there's something unusual going on. You don't understand why the person laughed at what seems to you to be the wrong moment, right? And so you drop down to the Pico level and you see that actually there were some cues that was the right moment to laugh at, or one possible moment to laugh at.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. Take voice dynamics. Okay, we are we attune to very subtle aspects of those. Okay, I can think of things like my daughter might come into my room when I'm working and I'm a little bit irritated because I've been interrupted. I've used this example before, and there'll be slight irritation in my voice, and she'll pick up on that, and say something like what's wrong or something like that. But I mention that because there's things like that are so very typical, and the point being here that it got me thinking then, well, what is going on there? if you just transcribe the word I said, or the wording, okay, you wouldn't get it. Okay, but it's something down there in the Pico-scale, a very, very subtle shift in voice dynamics, which she has picked up, tuned into, and which has in some way shifted her understanding of the situation. Okay, it's affected its dynamics because it's part of the affect, if you like. She's been affected by it, and then, okay, that shapes the... So you can drill down to those things. I mean, I think that's part of the point Jay just made. And you can see that there are moments when they really do matter. Okay, and if you don't have that perspective, then you're going to gloss over that. So that's just a little example of the kind of thing I mean. But it may not be voice dynamics. It could be something else, okay, facial or whatever, or of course some synergy of body dynamics. Okay, so yeah, it depends.
Jay, I'm reminded of your paper from Mind, Culture, and Activity. Maybe it was 2000, right? Where you were talking about timescales across activities and artifacts and within a kind of ecological or ecosocial frame, right? And
yes.
I mean, you were kind of an early pioneer to do some of this thinking about the ways in which timescales require different questions and potentially different methodologies to investigate. And it kind of, these can be embedded in some kind of form to answer, a kind of question using different tools to get at different aspects of the phenomenal experience. And anyway, I'm just mentioning that in part to give you a little kudos, but I mean, I've been intrigued by your work for many years because of this kind of, as it turns out now, to be very forward-thinking, theoretical, but also methodological work that you did now 2 decades ago or more.
Yes, I mean, I certainly have continued to find an emphasis on timescales to be a very useful perspective. And what I think most of the things that I've looked at from that perspective have taught me is that you always need to look at more than one timescale, or more than one level of organization of the dynamics and the system that you're looking at, and how those different levels interplay with one another. And I think that's an important part of the perspective that Paul is offering. You know, it's not a question of choosing whether we should be looking at the second order language in this situation, or we should be looking at Pico-scale languaging dynamics in this situation. It's a question of understanding how they interplay across each other, and when you should have your eye on which one, or on two of them or three of them all at once.
I mean, just to briefly, for graduate students anyway, both Jay and I have worked quite a bit within the Vygotskian and cultural historical activity theory framework, where you have activity, these broader societal frames, actions, which are more discrete and time-bounded, and operations, which typically are sort of beneath the level of conscious reflection or happening in real time. And these can also just be yet another framework for some of you interested that I think would articulate nicely with Paul and before him Nigel Love's work on languaging, first order languaging and second order language as well. And I think, as you come to think about the kind of time scale you're looking at or most interested in, we also need to understand that time scales are ecologically and mutually influencing one another. So, maybe really just kind of embedding that explicitly in the framework for your theoretical orientation or your methodology, and then looking for the methodology that would help you analyze the kinds of data you're looking at to answer the kinds of questions you're posing.
I think, for the graduate students, it's useful to know that historically there's been a kind of pairing of one time scale, one methodology, right? If you're interested in this, you use this method. You're interested in that, you use that method. And I think what we're moving towards now and in the future is finding ways to combine and integrate different methodologies that were originally designed for different timescales into one single research study or one multiplex way of answering a research question.
Okay, Bungi, you have a question. Can you ask? Bungi, I saw your question.
So I have a layperson's question, I guess. But as I'm listening more and more, it seems that the flow and dynamics and also synchronized conditions really do matter in understanding the languaging practices. And I'm wondering, what about static artifacts such as textbooks or policy documents? How can we analyze those static asynchronized materials from languaging perspective? Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, that is a really interesting question too, and I think it's a very important question. First of all, what I would say is, as you said, they're artifacts. Okay, with again on different scales, their material organization. Okay, and if you draw on, as I do in my work, I've had a long-standing engagement with Gibson's theory of affordances. I treat texts, as first of all, there's not a meaning in the text. There's a localized potential or set of potentials. Okay, and we interactively engage with these things. Okay, and we embed them in activities and cycles of activities. Okay, we interactively engage with them in ways which selectively activate different possibilities. I mean, one example which some of you will know from earlier work of mine is when the boys are responding to a text on a computer screen about aliens having arrived on the Earth. This is one I did some years ago. So they have a text, okay, which has appeared on the screen at that point in what's a game between two teams. They're 9-year-olds. In this example, a boys' team and a girls' team. So it's not as if the text determines what we do, but that's a really nice example of ways in which people then take the resources available in the text, resources which enable and constrain possibilities for action and different kinds of responses in that. And then what we see in the video, okay, and the analysis I've done of that, is one boy turns around and makes the other boy into, so to speak, an alien. Okay, so there are affordances, okay. I mean, after all, affordances in Gibson's sense, or I should say in his work, were in the first instance those of the physical world. But of course, he also recognized that affordances are social and cultural, including those of the body and so on. Okay, and that's what interests me there. Okay, so texts are things we do things with, basically. A lot of linguistics has tended to focus on the text and then analyze, often in great detail, its say, patterns of organization on different levels, clause above the clause, below the clause. And that's all very, and I've done my fair share of that as well. But what also interests me is, well, what do people do with texts? How do they selectively appropriate, draw on, transform that pattern in the service of some project, in which their interaction with the text is embedded. So that would take, when Steve a moment or two earlier mentioned the activity in the Vygotsky and Luria sense. Okay, we get a sense of that there. The text gets embedded in activities and cycles of activities. Okay, so as the meaning's not in the text offers us various affordance potentials, which we do things with.
Okay, Jay, your hand is up.
Yes, I mean, I think that even if you take very simple examples, just silently reading a text to yourself, This is already a dynamic activity, right? The movements of your eyes, the cycles of the eye movement across the text, whether you're taking in longer stretches of text or shorter stretches of text, when you pause and focus on a word, right? This is a dynamical process, certainly at the Pico scale. And then there is your implicit dialogue with the text, right? You are making meaning with this text by pulling it into interests and questions that you have, past experiences and other things you've read. You're doing a kind of dynamic intertextuality in dialogue with this text, moment by moment, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. So in that sense, you're approaching what could look like a static object in relationship to how you're making meaning with that text, how you're interacting with it, physically and cognitively. And you could also do this in the case, let's say, of writing a text, where it may become even more obvious. I wrote a long time ago a paper about this, where you imagine that you're halfway into writing an article or an essay or something like that, and you now have to write the next sentence, right? How do you decide what you're going to say in the next sentence? Very often you go back and reread what you just wrote in the previous sentence or the previous paragraph, and then you start to have some dialogue in yourself about that, and out of that dialogue comes the next turn in the dialogue, which becomes the next sentence that you write down. So again, you are interacting with what appears to be a static semiotic object, but it's a very dynamical process.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. You could say, putting it in a nutshell there, that the texts afford occasions of languaging of different kinds. Okay,
yes.
So they're embedded in, they get embedded in and get activated and enable different kinds of languaging. So it's not as if for me now, in the way I think about it, it's not the case that there's text over there on one side. Accordance theory, when we engage with artifacts, say whatever, a material artifact of any kind, we don't come onto it all at once, but we explore it in time and over time, okay, and selectively orient to different aspects of it which affect our experience of it. Okay, so that's another important aspect of it, the temporal dimension. So temporality, it's not so static after all. It affords another kind of temporality. Okay.
You can think of a text as a toy box, right? It contains a lot of symbols and signifiers and so forth that you can pick up and play with in a lot of different ways. But it's the playing with them, it's the interacting with them that makes meaning, that makes it meaningful. Otherwise, a book is just something that you can throw at somebody.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Thank you. I need to read a question from Amy. Sorry, Paul.
Okay. You're right.
So Amy has typed in a question. I'm reading from Amy's question on YouTube. On methodology, it seems to me that some intermediate constructs between first-order languaging dynamic and second-order language may also need to be developed. For example, in a scenario when a science teacher draws on an everyday example to explain complex science concepts. I want to add, I saw Stephen Colley's PowerPoint presentation saying first order performance is metabolism. Second order phenomenal or historical. So maybe this helps to address Amy's questions as well. Address Amy's questions first, and my question later. Okay.
I'm just pondering this a bit. I mean, I don't think the first order is non-historical, okay, because actually it's through the first order. Think of the histories of relationships, okay, and interaction histories and so on. They're after all constituted in and through the first order, okay. And of course we draw on aspects, selectively draw on aspects of what we're calling here the second order. Okay, so that example I gave a little earlier about a subtle shift in voice dynamics, which becomes very significant, it is part of a relationship. Okay, and you can't separate these things from the dynamics of relationships. That case, this is some years ago, that particular episode, and it was no big deal. It was a totally normal little thing. But these things do register and play out across longer timescales. So things going on in the first order are they're not a separate level. That they then feed into histories of relationships. Okay, and so on. And the dynamics of those. Okay, so and methodologically, and I doubt we've still got a long way to go here. Getting a handle, so to speak, on how those things do play out, how something that happens on a very tiny timescale, what we earlier called the pico, can start to play out over longer timescales. And we've still a long way to go before we fully understand these things. Okay, I mean, part of it's, I see. Part of it's empirical. We need the data stretched over longer timescales. Okay.
Yes, something that fascinates me in Amy's question, and which also sort of occurred to me when I was reading the manuscript of Paul's latest book, and I just reread my notes about that before this session, is the question of what kinds of levels of organization and dynamics there may be in between first-order languaging and second-order language. I mean, I think it's a convenient conceptual device and an important one for understanding the issues to make a distinction between the two. But if we actually think about this as a dynamical system, there must be levels in between what happens on pico timescales or what happens on timescales of seconds or minutes, and way up to what happens and changes over decades and centuries with changes in grammar or the great vowel shift or something like that. So, I think it's probably useful to at least try imagining what is 1.5 order scale in this case, right? First and a half order languaging or something like that.
Yeah. I mean that's totally right. I mean, I say in that new book too, it's multi-scalar. Okay, so clearly the idea of the original idea of 2 orders is some kind of a simplification to get a handle on some other problems. And we don't want to reify those. Okay, they're not 2 discrete separate levels. Okay, but it's just a way into what's a much bigger problem. Yeah, there are many different scales coming together. Okay, so would it be a mistake? I mean, I never thought it was just 2. Okay, but it's one way of getting at, well, first of all, getting away from the idea it's localized levels, one on top of the other, or however, although that too can be helpful at times, certainly. Okay, and therefore, getting at the idea that there are different timescales at work, okay, in a languaging event, but certainly it's not just 2, okay, and it would be wrong to think. I mean, the terminology first and second order might wrongly give someone the idea it's two discrete timescales. No, it's much more complex than that. So what Jay says is quite right there. It's multi-scalar, and we're still a long way from unpeeling all of those, because there's the empirical dimension that I mentioned a little earlier, and most work, including my own, tends still to be focused on episodes. Okay, but we need to go over much longer timescales. But as one human being working in my study, I can't tackle all of that on my own.
Yes, and I think this is, when we talk about methodology, it's not just the methodologies of data analysis, which I think is what graduate students mostly have in mind. It's methodologies of data collection. Right? How do you, for example, follow the developing idiosyncrasies of a particular two-person dyad over weeks or months or years, the way in which they come to tune into each other, the way in which certain pico-scale cues become automatic for them so that they know when the other person is serious or joking or irritated, and so on. And this is a very serious issue in terms of having the kind of data that we need to answer questions better about how those longer time scale system constraints actually are operating in the moment.
Bongi, you have a question. Why don't you ask it?
And I think you've already answered this through your discussion, but I just wanted to point it out. I'm just kind of curious. How would you explain the notions of self in the languaging? It seems that in the first order processes, the individuals have so much capacities to act and react, and it seems like that can be misunderstood as if the individuals have free will to act and unlimitedly and draw on different kinds of resources, the second order resources to act. So I am just getting curious to know how individuals will be understood in this languaging. Thank you.
You mean agency also, right? Yeah. You use free will, but you also, I know you have been working on agency.
Yeah.
Right, okay. I mean, there's a lot of talk now about agency. I tend myself to want to get away from the more postmodern ideas of agency, as if because they do tend to be very individualistic. Okay, but agency is something which itself is culturally constrained. I'll come back to the self in a moment and say a little bit about that. But you also mentioned agency, because agents and selves are not the same thing, and selves have agency in some moments and don't in others. Okay, but I think it's not a matter of just some unconstrained free will in the first order. Okay, because after all, we are massively constrained by all sorts of things that of all kinds. Okay, and massive is the word there. Okay, think of the consequences of transgressing some social norm. Okay, you can end up in the worst cases in jail, things like that. So there are all sorts of massive constraints operating, okay, on people, and that needs to be recognized, okay, and built in. So, and I think that some idea of the first order can be helpful there, because it does draw attention to the fact that agency is itself constrained and shaped by things that go beyond the individual. As for the self, I think, as I said earlier, I think in response to maybe the first question today, we become selves, we're not born selves. Okay, although the neurobiology would indicate we have a kind of proto-self, as Damasio would call it, from the beginning, because after all, we're affected by things which bring about felt change, okay, in what neurobiologists call the core self. Now, I don't want to go on about that now, but just to say that from a languaging point of view, languaging is critical to. It's not the only thing going on, and it doesn't go on its own anyway. I think when we start to take up stances, when it dawns on us, say, this is of course in infancy, that other people have different stances on things from us, different intentions, in different ways. Piaget and others have recognized this issue in infants. We recognize that the world is constituted in such a way that the other persons who populate it have different intentions, that we rub up against that, and we've got to deal with that. And I think that must be one of the selection pressures operating, which selects for, if you think about it in Halliday's terms, the transition from what he called infant proto-language into what he would call the adult language system. Okay, is the recognition we have to deal with this. We have to join in that community. So we constitute ourselves as able to take up stances in relationship to other people's stances, meaning, of course, when we do that, that we're accountable and held responsible and so on. Okay, but I can see angels coming in there.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm just reading Judith Green. Hi, Judith. Judith Green. She posted a question on YouTube. You are asking, of course, Judith, you're famous for your interactive ethnography. So this is a question from Judith. I wonder how a micro-ethnographic perspective might support tracing moments to larger histories of multiple participants to trace roots of what is being proposed, recognized, acknowledged, and accomplished. So it's kind of back to this methodology issue.
I think in a way part of what Jay also said a little earlier covers that we need to develop methodologies that can embrace these longer timescales and how things play out over longer timescales. We just need the data, but for a start, okay. And that I don't know Judith's work at all, but it poses a problem which is really central to all this. Getting a handle on how things play out across different timescales. So as Jay said earlier, for example, how one little moment where you have a fluctuation in voice dynamics actually feeds into things like human relationships, set, for example, in a family or whatever, over long timescales. Okay, and we need to understand that sort of thing a lot more. I'm sure the ethnomethodology and the ethnographic perspectives will be really important to doing that.
Yeah, thank you, Judith. I know you have your event map in the interactive ethnography, and that seems to be a very good methodology to do that. Our channel must invite you to come on board one of these days to give a seminar on that. I can see that Phoebe, you have a question. Why don't you ask your question, Phoebe?
Thank you. And I'm very curious about the use of technology nowadays, no matter in classroom setting or in personal learning setting. How about augmented reality or virtual reality? Because we are talking a lot about agency and also the experience before second order language. Would all these technologies contribute to the understanding of first order languaging with personal or social perspectives?
Can you when you say personal or social perspectives, can you say a little bit more about that first?
Yeah, because I'm thinking nowadays we talk a lot about how to use games, interactive games like the VR, AR games, to let individual experience something that is more than just the written text, because you explain a lot about how you see text as affordance. And then I'm thinking, for example, when I join an educational game as an individual being, and very often I situate myself in the virtual reality or augmented reality, and I don't just stop here, because very often when I get used to the affordance, I will be invited to socially interact with other players, and then it create multiple scales and time scale and level and our personal experiencing judgment and all this. I'm not sure if it's like the term Bonji just mentioned as agency. So I'm curious about what will happen to this whole experience and how would it academically contribute to your current study about process theory and understanding about the first order languaging and second order language.
I think there are a couple of other people. Steve is the one who can answer that much better than I can about games. He's online gaming and that. He's done a lot of work in that area. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't especially worked in that, so I don't feel I can really say a lot about it. Of course, just this is a very obvious point to make. Obviously, languaging has always been embedded in technologies of all kinds, and so you know, we're extending our selfhood, our agency, and so on through languaging across of course timescales too. That's really important. So going into what you call the virtual in that sense, okay, is important. Remember though that the idea of the virtual that a lot of people tend to have as propagated through the media, and that is, the virtual is a kind of surrogate for the real world. But actually, languaging itself, it creates virtual worlds. Okay, we after all, this is one of the distinctive things about the human ecology, languaging, but not only languaging, but we're focusing on that for the moment, is able to do. It is able to take us beyond the here and now to, as it were, move around and interact with virtual constructs of all kinds. So the kinds of technologies you're talking about probably build on those earlier in our evolution and those earlier potentials. But I mean, people like Steve know a lot more about online gaming than I do. I've never worked in that area, so he could say something more.
Well, I know, and Jay has worked quite a bit in online gaming environments. But just briefly, I mean, I fully endorse what Paul just mentioned. You know, language is a form of time travel. We can talk about the future in a projected sense. We can talk about the past. I mean, language does a tremendous amount already. But if you start thinking about it, and you mentioned a couple of different things. So online games like three-dimensionally rendered worlds where you play in avatar form versus a virtual reality where you're hyper-contextualizing an individual and his or her senses in a constructed environment of some kind. And then augmented reality would be, you know, either a HoloLens or potentially a mobile device where you laminate, as Goodwin would argue, information or new meanings or queries or tasks onto a biophysical as well as sociologically rendered world around you. So these are all really different phenomena. I would say that if you look at the kind of primordial condition of human communicative action, it's face-to-face typically, right? So the ways in which these new and highly mediated environments extend, potentially amplify the kinds of meaning-making potentials that we have as individuals and collectively together is something that I think makes them a really rich area for inquiry. And just to say very, very briefly, the use of, for example, a game methodology, and games are learning environments. Like any game worth its salt takes tens or even hundreds or thousands of hours to play, right? People play games because they're so hard, not because they're easy. So one of the things that games already are very complex environments in which development is pretty much the only thing that ever happens. You get increasingly difficult tasks, and increasingly robust resources and maybe a diversification of resources to engage those tasks or activities or quests or whatever. And so I think that there is a tremendous amount that we can learn about creating pedagogically and developmentally efficient and powerful environments from what's happening in game design and development. And then we'd want to very clearly differentiate, as I think you already know since you use these terms, but kind of game-based learning versus augmented reality versus virtual reality, all of which I think need to be differentiated in some detail for thinking about some of the questions you'd like to ask, which is another seminar. So, but Jay or maybe others of you would like to hold forth.
Yes, I've been fascinated by this area for a very, very long time. I wrote a paper, can't even remember how long ago, about education, cyberspace, and change that was only published online, and I think with my first online publication. But I mean, I can think of two things that might be useful here. One is, given our technologies, it's relatively easy to record the playing of games, and this is a source of data that has certain peculiarities or special features to it. Because in games, game time doesn't always run at the same rate as real-world time. There are some games that deliberately do run at real-world time, but most of them don't. And so it might be possible by recording gaming sessions or groups gaming together over long periods of game time to get a picture of what's happening over these longer time scales, that you then have enough data to be able to drill down even to the Pico level if and when that becomes useful. But you can encompass longer time scales here of people interacting together in a way that would be often very difficult to do in the real world, or first-order reality, as I usually call it. The second thing is a little bit like this notion of transsemiotizing or translanguaging, because as in augmented reality to some extent, but even without that, we mash up, we mix together our real-life interactions with people and our in-game interactions with people. And the way in which we interact with people in the game is influenced and draws on resources of the second-order language kind or the culture kind from both what's happening in the game and what's happening with those same people outside of the game. And people often play more than one game together in their friendship groups. And so you can have three-way interactions here of the cultural level or the longer time scale level affordances and constraints across ordinary life interactions, in game one interactions, and in game two interactions. So there could be potentially a very rich opportunity in analyzing that data to see how this interplay between different systems of meaning resources, how they interact and interplay, and how people juggle them at any given moment.
Thank you. I have this question from Judith Green on YouTube. I'm just reading it. So this is what Judith Green asks. Do you envision artifacts, texts, as actors in a particular developing activity, event, or context? How are ideologies about what counts as language developing in a dynamic process?
Can you say that again, Angel? I didn't quite catch it all on my end.
Right. I'm just reading from YouTube. You can also read on the YouTube.
I
can read it to you.
haven't seen it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you envision artifacts, texts, as actors? So I think yes, we all say these are actors in a particular developing activity or event. I think I can answer that for you. Yes, artifacts, texts, they can be actors, okay? And then the second part is more interesting. How are ideologies about what counts as language developing in a dynamic process? How are ideologies about what counts as language developing in a dynamic process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a very interesting question. I think ideology, I mean, the very fact we talked earlier about the distinction between the two orders brings up that point, because from the point of view of official literacies, often, the ideology of language is, and there's a very long tradition, you can see it. The ideology of language is, and there's a very long tradition, you can see it. I'm now hearing myself, so, okay. There's something wrong there.
Can those who are not speaking mute your phone? Can those of us who are not speaking mute your phone? And so Paul can be speaking now.
Okay, no, I just want to, what was I saying? I have to get it back now. But, I was saying about a long tradition going back to the ancient Greeks of grammar. But basically then they were solving or trying to deal with various pedagogical issues of how you teach, reading and things like that. So ideologies of language have been around for a long time. Most of and it's traditionally ideologies of language, as Linnell's book on the written language bias shows very well, have been shaped by the models and ideologies derived from written literacy. But we're getting out of that now, of course. So, okay.
Right, thank you. I'll come back to Judith's question. There is another question from one of our audience. Stephanie, you are saying, I'm wondering if your emphasis on the Pico-level precludes conscious, intentional decision-making by a proactive communicator.
No, absolutely not. I mean, one of the things I do highlight is that this is intentional activity, but there are these other layers which start to shade off into, first of all, we can modulate and have intentional control, at least to some degree, over the Pico. In some circumstances, more so than in others. In other cases, it will be more, I don't know what the right word would be, more shading into the non-voluntary. But overall, languaging is an intentional form of action. It's a form of action above all. So no, the intentional is very central. Not in the old-fashioned cognitive sense of intentionality being a cause standing behind the act, but something that modulates the act along its entire trajectory. So basically, intentionality is really important and really central.
Okay, Judith has given our conversation.
I'm something on my end, Angel. Something's going wrong.
I'm reading.
Yeah.
I'm reading from Judith. Okay, I'm trying to make it closer to you. So Judith is asking a question about transcender. as a possible tool. Yeah. My question focused on ideologies as ongoing constructions and visible in what John Gumpus framed as linguistic, cultural, and social presuppositions that people bring to and construct in a developing event. So I'm reading from Judith Green's question. See, we need to interact with sociolinguists, okay? Judith is sociolinguist, disciple of John Gumpus.
Yeah, I'm having some technological problems here. There's some kind of delay and some kind of distortion in the last few minutes has started to creep in here. And can you hear me?
Yes,
I can hear you.
I think the problem is here that everybody can. I think now it has been restored. Just now I've also observed some of the issues, but I think it's now restored.
Okay, because I'm not sure. Okay, maybe someone else can take that. I'm not sure I got it all.
Yeah. Maybe I can step in here a bit, since I am familiar with Judith's work and with the sociolinguistic tradition from Gumpertz and Hymes and various others. I'm not sure I completely understand the intention of Judith's question about ideologies developing, but I connect this a little bit with the work of Michael Silverstein and other people on linguistic ideology, meaning basically what our culture has to say about language itself. And perhaps sociolinguistically, one can expand that to our attitudes about what's good language and what's bad language, what's acceptable and unacceptable, what makes sense in this situation or doesn't make sense in this situation, how what you say indexically positions you for me as being a person of a educated elite or of an oppressed minority, and so forth. And these are all, I think, additional systems of systemic constraints and affordances at the same general level and timescale as what we're calling second-order language. So that it's not just language itself, but it's a culture that that recognizes that there is a thing it calls language, right? And along with that has all sorts of normative views and opinions about language and what language is and how language should be used. And I think that those are always around us. Sometimes we're not even very aware of how they're acting on us. And you may be able to sit down, for example, with a transcript of a conversation, and if you have training in linguistics or conversation analysis, right, you can uncover some of the second-order language influences on what's happening in that conversation. But if you don't have training in sociolinguistics or anthropology, you might not be able to see what's going on there in terms of prejudices and ideologies about language and how language should be used. So nobody can analyze something from every possible point of view, but I think we should, in working in this field, be aware that there are these other dimensions and that maybe we need some collaborators who are expert in this to help us get a more complete understanding.
Yeah, so Judith was typing. How Jay, it is based on Norman.
Okay,
Sure.
I can jump in and help read Judy Screen's questioning here. Actually, he said, "Hi Jay, it is based on Falcon's perspective from critical discourse analysis." So I'm wondering, Jay has any response for that?
Yes, yes. I think I think my response probably is relevant also in that perspective. I know Norman Fairclough's work very well, and have worked with him and some of his collaborators in the past. And the concern there is particularly with the ways in which our use of language reflects power relationships and political priorities and dominance relationships, gender relationships, and social and political ideologies, not of the Silverstein linguistic ideology stripe, but of the ordinary, everyday political ideology stripe. But again, this is another important dimension of what's going on, probably in every interaction. I mean, even between a caregiver and a child, there are ideologies about how children should behave or not behave, and what the relationship between, say, a mother and a child ought to be or ought not to be. If the child is adopted from a different cultural group, one can imagine many of these coming into play, including power relationships and gender relationships.
Chinhua, can you read out Amy's question?
Sure. Here's Amy's question. Amy Wu said, constructs that can account for multi-dimensions at the same time. For example, processes, timescales, and mediums, communicative resources. I wonder if there's any candidate in this direction.
May I actually? Actually,
Okay, this is Amy.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Amy.
Hi.
Yeah, the first part of the question actually is following up with the discussion between first order and second order language, and then I think of the issue probably if we could actually, it is not two ends of a continuum, right? So then a question emerged to me would be like, is it one way forward would be to anchor analysis in a construct that can account for multi dimensions, like Professor Lemke has mentioned, like processes, time scales, and mediums. That means communicative or semiotic resources, right? So that's my way of as I listen along this dialogue. So then I wonder whether you have any candidates in this kind of directions, or if my thinking is on the right track. And one candidate I can think of would be the concept of semantic pattern that is actually developed by Professor Lemke. That he talks about semantic pattern as a construct that can conceptualize the contents of for example, the contents in scientific dialogue, but it is also an activity sequence the semantic pattern is embedded in activity sequence. Am I understood? Can you all hear me?
Yeah,
I can hear you.
I'm having some trouble hearing at times. There's something going wrong in the system.
Oh.
Okay. And sometimes too, the video is getting, I don't know, it's as if it slows down or something. It's a bit weird.
Oh, it's all because of your Wi-Fi. It's just like me. My Wi-Fi is a very basic plan. Okay.
No, mine's supposed to have a high speed. Anyway,
I think it's the interconnections. Remember, we are on 3 different continents, all trying to act like we're in the same room. So sometimes it doesn't work.
Yeah, I guess it's and in this moment of coronavirus, there's very high usage of the internet, so that can drain the system's capacity.
Yes.
I think anyway.
Well, I don't know. Did you hear Amy's entire question, Paul?
But maybe if she could just quickly recapitulate it, that would help. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry
I will
about
make it
that,
simple. Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
At the moment, I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I'll quickly simplify it. That's following up the discussion about intermediate constructs between first order languaging and second order language. So
Yeah. Okay.
I think of that definitely not as two ends of the same continuum. So then I'm thinking whether there's any constructs that can actually capture multi-dimensions at the same time. That, for example, the processes, the time scales, and the mediums or semiotic resources that have been employed or deployed in this process. So that's the idea I learned from Professor Lemke's when he developed the idea of flows, translanguaging and flows. So I wonder if any of you would think of this would be one directions forward. And if there's any candidates or candidate constructs like that would capture this way of thinking, or would this be a right direction forward? Yeah, that's my question.
Well, yeah, okay. I mean, one of the important things that in the discussion earlier that we were saying is you know because you mentioned these 2 orders, the first and the second order. It's not as if it's not that simple. There aren't just 2 timescales. There are many, you know. So I mean, I made the point. Jay also talked about this. It's multi-scalar. So, but I mean, you can see how even in children's indexical gestures around 3 months old, they're no longer on the immediate embodied timescale, if you like, but they're being shaped by things coming from other timescales. So, and this is very much part of the dynamics of the thing, as they're being entrained to and shaped by, and are not in any passive sense, because they are actively orienting to and picking up on the fact that certain types of patterns are those which are normatively valued in the culture. So, in the local culture. So more and more timescales get wrapped up together, basically, and that's one of the puzzles that we still need more work on over longer. You know, this is the point that Jay made, that I also made earlier, over much longer data spans than is currently the case. But I think you also mentioned, Jay can better talk about this than I can, but his idea of thematic systems. But I wasn't sure what the point was there, because I had some trouble hearing what you said.
Yes, maybe I can pick up that part of the response. Because, yes, the notion of semantic systems or semantic patterns or thematic systems, thematic formations, I think is what I eventually wound up calling them, they are an attempt at making an intermediate construct between, say, lexicogrammatical systems, which might apply across all registers, and a particular text, which has a lot of semantic specificity to it. And the idea was that you could have one common pattern, one common way of speaking about some topic in science, which you could see that same pattern, that same system of semantic relationships among terms and phrases, You could see that in the dialogue in the classroom. You could see it in the written textbook. You could see it in the examination questions. You could find it in a laboratory in the discourse of scientists talking to each other, and so forth. It's not nearly as general as something like lexicogrammar. It's much more semantically specific, and it changes on a much faster time scale than lexicogrammar does. But what Amy said that intrigued me was how would that be related to notions like mediums and flows or systems of processes. One of the things I talk about briefly in a few papers is the process that sometimes is called Entextualiation. That is, how do you go from a relatively stable pattern of abstract semantic relationships to an actual utterance that is conforming to that pattern, right? Which is one of the key things we're looking for. That, I think, is an area where research could be very fruitful, to try and get a handle on exactly how people move back and forth between these sort of standardized semantic patterns of speaking about a particular topic and the actual utterances or sentences of a discourse or a text. Because that itself is also, it's a languaging process, it's a dynamical process, but it's one in which the more abstract, longer time scale, more quasi-stable patterns are particularly visible and in evidence.
I mean, maybe too the idea of habitus in the Bourdieu sense, but bodily habitus, as he talked about, how you get quasi-stable patterns. I mean, you see it in different cultures. Having lived in Italy for a long time, as one example, stabilized gestural patterns, forms of body movement, and that kind of thing. And there are clear differences between cultures. That they're hard on first encounter, hard to say exactly what they are, but they are there. And so there are all sorts of things like that. That's probably another example of an intermediate formation, but more drilling down into the bodily there, whereas the thematic formations are a much higher order thing. So these things probably play out on many different scales, and you'd see it in families too. Patterns of interaction, stabilized bodily habitus that play out. Okay, so through different media, okay, and so on. So dynamic processes that get some kind of stabilization. After all, what's habit and routine would be part of that story there.
Yes. Yeah, I think just a very quick add in here, you have the notion of body hexis, which comes from anthropology, that people in different cultures walk differently, hold their necks differently, gesture differently, and so on. And then you have the Bourdieu notion, which I think comes originally from the body hexis idea. I think Bourdieu borrowed it and expanded it in the way that Paul described. And then you have the degrees of automation of these processes, where they start to become automatic and unconscious. And I think that for people who are extremely fluent in the language of a particular discipline or topic, people who are expert engineers or scientists or doctors or whatever, they can just sort of rattle on with speaking the discourse of their subject in a way that is as much habit-driven as it is moment-to-moment intentionality. Politicians are very good at that.
And teachers.
Yeah.
Professors are very good at this too.
Sorry. No, I'll make my point in a moment.
It was just to make a brief comment around the sort of broader sociological implications of what's happening here. I mean, obviously, discipline, specificity, academic discourse, competence, and all of this is really a function of normativity. Durkheim, 120 years ago, said normativity is the social fact, right? And basically all social action is in some way informed by move and response within this kind of normative context. And to briefly tie it into Bourdieu, I'm a huge Bourdieu fanboy still, but all of these linguistic encounters that we have are happening within, as Bourdieu would describe it, discursive fields, within which certain kinds of capital have positive or negative valence. So with scientists, you really need to make the talk in a very particular kind of way. And so, when you don't have those morphosyntactic realizations, those collocational patterns, et cetera, that are expected in that kind of environment, then you're not doing good, as ethnomethodologists would describe it, recipient design. You're not designing your utterances with adequate alignment to the norms of that discursive field. And so just to sort of, I think there's a lot of really good thinking about why these sorts of disciplinary associations with particular kinds of language use for particular functions or in particular contexts is super important. Just to underscore what both Paul and Jay have been saying.
No, the normativity thing's really critical there. When I was working in Hong Kong a number of years ago in the with Angel, the Faculty of Education there, we would go out certain times of the year to observe the students in the practicum. Okay, and what really struck me, you'd see them on a number of occasions over maybe a 6-week period, how they literally, it was really fascinating. And I thought at the time, God, it would be really interesting if we could get video data. They more and more embodied the role of the teacher. Okay, so to speak. Yes. Very subtle but very real and perceptible changes in the way they were behaving, interacting in the classroom. It was really quite amazing. And I wish I got data on that at the time, but we couldn't do it then, of course. So that's a nice, that would be a little example, just anecdotally, of that kind of thing. Because the normativity is really central there. Okay.
Thank you. I want to welcome Judith. Hi, Judith. I can see that you've come into our Blue Jeans. Okay, you want to say something?
Hi, Judith Green.
Hi.
Don't let the boys speak all the time. Don't let all the boys speak all the time.
Girl power. Okay. I'm finding this really fascinating because I am at the intersection of what you've been talking about, but also from a Gumper's interactional sociolinguistic frame and also a micro-ethnographic frame. And that I've got, if you're interested in seeing what it is, it traces from those local moments because our research is over 10 years with one teacher holding that constant as she moves with bilingual children across time as well as across the year. So we've traced from the very first moments children enter a class across the whole year through cycles of activity, not through individual episodes. And we just finished a paper for a new book which has just come out for novices, looking at data analysis through this kind of lens and other lenses. But it's from the new literacies people. So the literacies world has been trying to develop some of the issues you're talking about, and I see high potential for the dialogue today with a group of people I understand in the literacy field. In ILA, we have a special research network, if you're interested, which is bringing the literacies in social contexts. And one of Angel's students did a chapter we have a special volume of TLA, which is the Trabalhos de Linguística Aplicada from Brazil, from the Federal University in Rio de Janeiro. It's coming out this week or next week, and it will be online. But The key is that from any one moment, according to Michael Agar and linguistic anthropology, you can trace the trail, the roots, and the routes that people take in building that kind of dialogue. And especially, my question was, when you have a new group forming, not just an individual going in and having a dialogue, like a class or a game online, how does that, with all these different people coming together, create a common floor in Goffman's sense that they can then have a dialogue from, begin to understand and build a common language? Or Jim G and I wrote on their 4 systems: materials, social, activity, and semiotic, but there are multiple semiotics. Everything you've said today fits into that in another way that I've not thought about, so it's very exciting. But how many systems are being built in a group that's coming together to be sustaining for a given period of time, not forever? Not just the individual's language experience, but the collective systems for communicating. So that's a piece that I'd love to have you think about with me, or help me understand further, because I hear it as a resource of the individual and of a social world, but not necessarily of the group forming.
Yeah, I think the group forming thing is really very important there. One of the things that struck me, what you just said, is the movement thing. We basically, this is one of the ways I like to think about it. We learn to move along with others down pathways and trajectories which we create together. Okay. So getting away from these static ideas of sending messages to each other, but moving together, and so on. I think that, and languaging is one of the resources that we deploy to lay down pathways, basically, that we move along together, and affect each other, and so on.
That's really interesting, because in a class, at least at the elementary school level, not more the high school and second and higher ed level, you have multiple groupings of children. Rarely do you have a singular event. You'll have children from different abilities, different configurations that have been grouped in different ways. Some of them will have access, even if what you're talking about coexists at the collective level. Not all children will have access to that resource and therefore cannot necessarily move with us. So from the interactional socio-ethnographic frame we bring, you have the collective development, which Edwards and Mercer talk about from a more cognitive frame. And then you have step back analytically for us and look at the individual within that, which I think was brought up earlier.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. See, I see intersections. That's why I'm excited. And I just wonder, when we take a new group forming, there's a book that Ulla Erstad and Sefton Green did on the learning lives and identity of youth in a digital age that trace different analytic traditions. I just think that what you're talking about brings the need for us to bring our different traditions together to create the bigger picture.
Yeah, I certainly agree. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I sometimes get those different volumes from Ulla Erstad mixed up, but I had a chapter in one of them with the Learning Lives title, and that again is as you say, is a very good example of tracing things over longer timescales and actually following kids into school, out of school, to their homes, in their neighborhoods. A project which required a great deal of money and effort on the part of a lot of people in order to get something like that to work. And there are a few other examples of this kind of longer term local group ethnography that are potentially very useful kinds of data. When I was reading the manuscript of Paul's book, one of the things that I commented on and thought about was this notion of transient groups. Transient, because so much of our research and our perspectives, especially sociological ones, presume relatively stable institutions. And so, we have a lot of research on the kinds of language that goes on in relatively stable institutions and their norms and genres and all that. And we have a lot of research on spontaneous conversation where a few people get together for a very short period of time. But in between, is this very important domain of groups that come together for a period of weeks or months. They're not meant to become permanently institutionalized, but they do develop this common ground, this common floor, this sort of a temporary local culture, and that is a great laboratory for observing this process of going multiscalar, of going across the scales from what's happening in the moment to what persists over a day, what persists over 3 weeks, what changes over 7 weeks, and so forth. So I think that I totally agree, Judith, with this notion that there needs to be an intellectual dialogue between that kind of work and that kind of data and the other ones that Paul has been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Any precise? Yep, Judith, yes. Judith, someone asked you to show the book again. Could you show the book again?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. There are actually 4 books that have come out in 2019 that address similar things that you're talking about, but from within an educational perspective. But if you want them, there's one on argumentation by David Bloom and George Newell. There's one that Greg Kelly and I did on science and engineering contexts with different groups of people. But these are pieces where you're getting schooling is not, what did you call it, Jay? The groups that come together and go away?
Transient.
Transient, yeah.
Yeah, they're not transient. They're more stable, but at the elementary school level, especially, or preschool level, they're bounded in time, but not singularities of structures.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
Especially now in this innovative stage we're in, how these things get constructed, how we learn from each other. It seems to me that's a key piece. I don't know if you've seen the Grimshaw books where they brought all the different linguists and sociolinguists and
yes,
together.
The multiple perspective analysis. Yeah.
The MAP project, they have 2 editions of it. One is in 1985 and one is in 1994. But I have a book that did multiple perspectives too, Green and Harker, that looked at the same data from different angles, but had different people coming. It seems to me that we've developed such rich, deep, theoretical, conceptual understandings of phenomena that rather than asking basic questions about what they are, bringing them together to look at what the integration of them or where they differ, what difference that makes, would be tremendously exciting. Will Eierstad and Septon Green did that. They brought us all together in Norway.
Right.
And we all looked at how we talked about these things. It was about 8 or 10 or 12 different theorists. Jay was one of them. I was one of them. But the key is that how do we begin to understand and make it accessible? And this is what this book I just showed was, it's for novices. How do we bring the younger people in? And I know Amy and I have had some conversations, and we're going to continue to do that. How do you bring that to foreground it in order to make transparent? This is our American Education Research Association is calling for transparency. I know a lot about what you were talking about, but I don't know all the literatures. I know some of your work. I don't know everyone's work. So how do we bring it forward is my question. I'm so excited. You can tell.
Yes, yes.
This is the most dynamic learning experience I've had in ages.
One of the good consequences of Angeline and her students' work and our peculiar circumstances in the world right now. But I really want to emphasize what Judith just said about the younger generation, the new scholars coming up, because a lot of this work of integration is going to be the responsibility of this next generation. We have done a lot of the groundwork for this. We've developed these multiple perspectives, and the next generation can use them as resources to juggle and mash up and integrate and build on. And I think that something that we in the older generation need to think about is the fact that very often the academic structures of our universities are not so friendly to multidisciplinary projects and collaborations as they pretend to be and give lip service to.
I will agree with you, Jay.
Okay. Now, you can see that we have 2 hours. And, Judith, please type in all those books, because we have many questions asking you to post the titles of the books on YouTube. So please do that. And it is precisely the aim of our channel to bring our students, emerging scholars, because this is our future. I mean, we need to pass on to this next generation. So I will pass the floor to all the other student hosts here, say something, and then we need to say goodbye and announce the next seminar. Yeah. Okay. Qinghua, you start.
Okay, thank you. I would like to say that it's a great honor for us to be able to listen to the discussion and even jump in and ask questions. I think it's a very exciting experience for me, and I would like to say thank you to everybody. Thank you.
Alessia? Thank you.
Well, I also like to say thank you. It's an amazing opportunity to see you all face to face, like before reading your books and articles, and now it's like seeing you. It's an incredible experience. I unfortunately didn't have a chance to ask any questions, but I learned so much. It was such a great conversation, so much interesting new information to me. So thank you so much for sharing.
Phoebe, are you still there, Phoebe?
Yeah. And thank you very much. And on behalf of Hong Kong students, teachers, and also researchers, we value a lot of discussion today. And it's very inspiring in terms of both practical concern and also some theoretical understanding about how different mechanisms may interact and have dialogues. And we look forward to reading all the books and publications again and again. Thank you.
Amy? Amy, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm so grateful for joining in this event, and actually it will be a once for a lifetime that we'll have gurus in multiple disciplines joining together, like Judith, Jay, and Paul, and also it is all initiated by Angel. And so I recall our book, upcoming book chapter, 3 generations of researchers. So it takes a village to research a village. I really appreciate that. And thanks a million and a trillion. And everybody take care. And I look forward to more fruitful discussions and probably also collaborations. Yeah.
Anyone understand this Korean?
It's no, it's a heart. It's a heart.
That's a heart.
Yeah, we can use our body language.
Practice social distancing and physical distancing.
Yeah. Coordinating our bodies.
Okay. I want to thank everybody. Now, we have an announcement to make. April 22nd, we have the next event with Eugene Matusov and Jay Lemke. And all of you, I will invite you into the Blue Jeans virtual room. Okay, and the topic is very much related to today's topic. It's about pattern recognition, subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and dialogue in education. So tune in and we will post all the references that Judith and other speakers mentioned today. We have to say goodbye now and tune in until the next event, April 22nd.
Okay, bye-bye.
I want to hug you, but I cannot. We have to practice social distancing, physical distancing. So
多谢，再见。
Bye-bye, 再见。
再见, bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye. Thank you, everyone. I can go back to bed now, I think.
Get your sleep, Paul, and thank you for getting up in the middle of the night to be with us.
Okay, no, I enjoyed it. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.